G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Israel Past, Present and Future. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thanks for coming along. We're into session 6 tonight. We're still in Israel Present, and we're looking at the Mosaic Covenant and the Law of Moses, how that affects them. Just to do with covenant theology, covenant theologians believe that the law of Moses is a rule of life for us today, believe it or not. And they use this point as evidence of their superiority of their system of theology over dispensationalism, which is where most of us in that camp. An example of this we can read in one covenant author, where he says that he asked a question, and is the New Testament law or moral code a contradiction to the Old Testament moral code? So this question he's asked. It cannot be a contradiction if God has not changed, and if he is immutable. The New Testament law is simply a restatement of the same Old Testament law. That's covenant theology. To say, as dispensationalists do, that we are not on the Old Testament law, but on the New Testament law, is to posit two kinds of law from one immutable God. There is one law and one lawgiver. They quote James 4:11 and 12 for that. The same 10 commandments that judged Israel judge us today, and they quote from Romans 13:8 to 10 and James 2:8 to 13. They go on to say that to posit two law systems is incipient to idolatry. For two conflicting systems of morality infer two gods with differing moralities. If the two law systems are the same, then why the fuss that we are not under Old Testament moral law? And who can improve on God's Old Testament laws in adultery, theft, sodomy, blasphemy, etc.? Now, this is a statement that some covenant theologian authors write. This is what they believe. Except that these statements now break down when one comes to specifics, and in practice, actually, none of the claimants really believe it. Even the authors of this statement that they made here, which I just read, have dismissed the ceremonial law earlier on in their work. The other laws mentioned in this quote are a very select list and concern only those areas where the law of Moses and the law of Messiah agree. Covenant theologians ignore too many other laws, such as the wearing of clothes made of mixed threads. They don't keep that. They ignore that Leviticus 11 distinguishes between clean and unclean foods, but that, remember, Jesus in Mark 7:19 and the apostles in Romans 14 verse 4 declared all meats clean. They talk about the same 10 commandments, but then obviously reinterpret the fourth commandment on the Sabbath, which is what David mentioned last week when we were talking. Covenant theologians claim that it is all one and the same law. That's wishful thinking. It's also very sloppy interpretation at worst of the scriptures. So this is trying to prove a theology by ignoring the details. So covenant theologians emphasize the moral code, but that was hardly the totality of the law of Moses. Covenant theologians need to make adjustments to the law of Moses to make it mandatory for today. And even when they limit the law to the 10 commandments, they must readjust and fudge the figures, fudge the books, if you like, to readjust for the Sabbath commandment considerably. So covenant theologians live under and with the same basic commandments that dispensationalists do. Yet, as dispensationalists, there's a far more solid theological and exegetical basis for how they deal with the law of Moses. And that's why dispensationalists, we're not forced to pick out of the law what is for today and what is not for today. That's just a quick burst on covenant theologians and what they believe. They believe that the law of Moses is still in effect today. One glaring mistake or one glaring flaw in their theology, and what they conveniently ignore, is that the Mosaic law was given to Israel only and not to the church. It was given to Israel. It was a law for the Jewish nation. Okay. The unity of the law of Moses. We need to look at this. Two factors have developed in the minds and teachings of many Christians that have brought confusion over the law of Moses. One factor is the practice of dividing the law into ceremonial, legal, and moral commandments, all the 613 commandments. And then based on this division, many have come to think that the believer is free from the ceremonial and legal requirements of the Mosaic law, but we're still obligated to keep the moral commandments of the Mosaic law. These divisions, they're great if you're going to simply study the laws, right? But they're not divinely inspired, and they're not divinely authoritative. All three parts together make up the whole 613 commandments of the law, which was given as a single unit to Israel. Now, the Mosaic law does contain legislation related to Israel's moral, religious, and civil life. We know that. It tells us that. However, when you then divide the parts to support the contention that some of the law is still operative as a rule of life today, while other parts are not, then there's a whole new concept is introduced. And that concept is foreign to the Old Testament. It's a completely different thing. Now, the second factor is the belief that the 10 commandments are still valid today, while the other 603 commandments are not. And so the individual who takes this approach, such as the Seventh-day Adventists, they run into problems concerning the fourth commandment, which is on keeping the Sabbath. At that point, they got to fudge things a bit. They got to jockey things around to make it fit. So it's inconsistent. Now, we need to understand that the Mosaic law is viewed by the scriptures as a single unit. The word Torah or law, when applied to the law of Moses, is always singular. It is never the Mosaic laws. It is always the Mosaic law, even though it contains 613 commandments. And the same is true of the Greek word that is used, which is nomos in the New Testament. It's a single unit as well. Division of the law of Moses into ceremonial, legal, and moral parts. It's good if you're going to study separate parts like that. But the law is never divided in this way by the scriptures themselves. We're the ones who divided it like that. Neither is there any scriptural basis for separating the 10 commandments from the rest of the law and declaring only these 10 as being perpetual. All 613 commandments are a single unit comprising the law of Moses. This is the principle of the unity of the law of Moses that lies behind the statement found in James chapter 2, verse 10, where James writing, he says, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, all 613 commandments, and yet stumble in one point, he's become guilty of all 613 commandments, of breaking all 613 commandments." So James makes it very clear. A person needs only to break one of the 613 commandments to be guilty of breaking the entire law of Moses. This can only be true if the Mosaic law is seen as a single unit. If it is not, the guilt lies only in whatever particular command a person violates, and not in the whole law. In other words, if one breaks a legal commandment, he's guilty of breaking the ceremonial law and moral laws as well. Same is true of breaking a moral or a ceremonial commandment. If the Mosaic law is still in effect, for instance, and a Jewish person, for instance, if he ate bacon and eggs today for breakfast, he's just broken the law because he's eaten pork. Makes him guilty of breaking the 10 commandments, but nothing to do with eating pork in the 10 commandments, but it's in the rest of the 603 commandments. So he's now guilty of breaking everything. So in order to have a clear understanding of the law of Moses and its relationship to the believer, Jewish or Gentile, it's necessary to view it as the scriptures view it, a unit that cannot be divided into parts that have been done away with and parts that have not been done away with. One cannot separate certain commandments from the whole body of law in such a way as to give them a different status than the other commandments. Now, the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative, and this is a clear-cut teaching of the New Testament, and that is that the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative, and that happened with the death of Messiah, death of Jesus. In other words, the law in its totality, all 613 commandments, no longer has any authority over any individual. And this is evident from several passages. The first one is Romans 7:1-6, where Paul, writing to the Roman church, he said, or are you ignorant, brethren? For I speak to men who know the law, Mosaic law, that the law has dominion over a man for so long as he lives. For the woman that has a husband is bound by law to the husband while he lives. But if the husband die, she is discharged from the law of the husband. So then, if while the husband lives, she be joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if the husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be joined to another man. So what Paul is saying is, when a husband dies, his wife becomes a widow. She's then no longer bound to the law of the husband, but she's now free to remarry without committing the sin of adultery. She's now free from the law because a death has taken place. And Paul then makes the theological application in verses 4-6. Wherefore, my brethren, you also were made dead to the law through the body of Messiah, that you should be joined to another, even to him who was raised from the dead, that we might bring forth fruit unto God. So what he's saying is that since a death has taken place, the death of the Messiah, the believers have now been made dead to the law through the body of Messiah. Paul goes on to say in verse 5, for when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were through the law wrought in your members to bring forth fruit unto death. What he's saying here is now the sin nature can no longer use the law, Mosaic law, as a base of operation. And finally, in verse 6, Paul states that we have been discharged from the law. But now we have been discharged from the law, having died to that wherein we were held, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter. So one is either married to the law of Moses or to the Messiah. Can't be married to both. He cannot be married to both. And when Paul writes he's referring to Messianic Jews, since Gentiles were never under the law of Moses. But it is a guideline for us. Now, the only conclusion one can make is that the law, the Mosaic law, has now been rendered inoperative through the death of the Messiah. Second passage Paul uses to show that the law of Moses had been rendered inoperative with the death of Messiah is Romans 10, verse 4. He says, for Messiah is the end of the law unto righteousness to everyone that believes. Now, of interest in the order of words in the beginning of the verse, in the Greek, the first word is the word telos, translated as end. The order of words in the Greek puts the focus on this term, telos, end. Telos can mean two things. First, it can mean termination. So Messiah is the termination of the law. He brought the end of the law, and this is the primary meaning of the term. And second, telos can mean goal. The goal of the law was the Messiah. So the law was not an end in itself, but it was intended to bring one to faith in the Messiah. It doesn't matter whether telos is being translated as goal or termination, since other scriptures teach both units, both truths. The Messiah is the goal of the law, but he's also the termination of the law. He's the end of the law. And so it is important to keep in mind that since Messiah is the end of the law, it means that there's no justification through the Mosaic law system. Galatians 2:16 tells us that. Now, this was always true, but there is also no sanctification or perfection through the law, Mosaic law. Hebrews 7:19 tells us that. So it should be very evident then that the law of Moses has come to an end in Messiah and cannot function in justification or sanctification. Especially for the believer, it has been rendered inoperative. Romans 10:4 should also be interpreted within the wider context of the book of Romans, which includes what Paul said back in chapter 7, verses 1-6, when he declared that we are free from the law and discharged from the law. So consistency with the context means that Romans 10:4 must mean termination and not goal. So, third passage, to show that the law was never meant to be a permanent administration, but a temporary one, is Galatians 3, verse 19. What then is the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise has been made. And in the context, in verses 15 to 18 of Galatians 3, Paul stated that the law of Moses was an addition to the Abrahamic covenant. It was added for the purpose of making sin very clear, so that all will know that they have fallen short of God's standard of righteousness. It was a temporary addition until the seed, and the seed was the Messiah, would come. And now that he has come, the law is finished. The addition has ceased to function with the cross. So the law, the purpose of the law was, when it tells you, you shall not lie, when you lie, you knew you'd sin, because the law says you don't lie. That was his purpose. Fourth passage we see with Messiah, there is now a new priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, not according to the order of Aaron. Remember, Aaron was from the Levitical line. His line were the priests. The law of Moses now provided the basis for the Levitical priesthood, and there was an inseparable connection between the Mosaic law and the Levitical priesthood. According to Hebrews 7, verses 11 to 18, a new priesthood required a new law under which it could operate. And the point made in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 11 to 12, is that under the law, Mosaic law, only one type of priesthood was permitted, and that was the Levitical priesthood. Levitical priesthood could not bring perfection, because they had to offer sacrifice for their own sins as well. This is explained for us in Hebrews 9:11 to 10:18, which states very clearly that animal blood cannot bring perfection. It only covered the sins. Only the Messiah's blood could do that. So the Mosaic law was the basis for the Levitical priesthood. And for the Levitical priesthood to be done away with and to be replaced by a new priesthood, the order of Melchizedek, it required a change of law. Remember, Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, and from the tribe of Judah, there was no priest. Priests could only come from the Levitical tribe. As long as the law of Moses was in effect, no other priesthood was valid except the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood. And verses 13 to 7 of chapter 7 of Hebrews tells us that. So, was there a change of law? Hebrews 7 verse 18 states that the Mosaic law was disannulled. Because it is no longer in effect, there's now a new priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. If the Mosaic law were still in effect today, Jesus could not function as a priest. Because the Mosaic law is no longer in effect, he can be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So consequently, the law of Moses has been disannulled in favor of a new law that is the basis for the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. Another passage, the fifth one, the law was the middle wall of petition that was now broken down according to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. Earlier on in this study, we covered that God made 4 unconditional eternal covenants with Israel, and all of God's blessings, both material and spiritual, are mediated by means of these 4 Jewish unconditional covenants. God also made a 5th covenant, which was temporary and conditional. This was the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant contained the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law served as a wall of petition to keep Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying Jewish spiritual blessings. And if Mosaic law were still in effect today, it would still be a wall of petition to keep Gentiles as Gentiles away. If you wanted to enjoy the blessings of the unconditional Jewish covenants, you had to convert to Judaism and live as a Jew, a Gentile living as a Jew, to be able to enjoy the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. Now, what Ephesians 2:14-15 tell us is that the wall of petition was broken down with the death of Messiah. And since the wall of petition, which was the Mosaic law, was broken down, that meant that the Mosaic law, or the law of Moses, was now done away with. And based on faith, Gentiles can and do enjoy Jewish spiritual blessings by becoming fellow partakers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua. The two have become one. The sixth line of evidence is based in Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 to chapter 4, verse 7. In this passage, verse 24 says, so that the law is become our tutor to bring us onto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So verse 24 says the law is looked upon as a pedagogue or a tutor. So he's a tutor over a minor, a young child, to bring him to mature faith in Messiah. And that was the purpose of the law. Having become believers, verse 25 now tells us in Galatians 3, but now that faith is come, we are no longer under a tutor. So we're no longer under this tutor, which is the law of Moses. And as clearly as it could be stated, this passage teaches that with Messiah's coming, the law is no longer in effect. Seventh line of evidence is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 to 11. We'll read these verses. Paul writing, he says, you are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read of all men, being made manifest that you are an epistle of Messiah, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in tables that are hearts of flesh. And such confidence have we through Messiah to Godward, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to account anything as from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But if the ministration of death, written and engraven on stones, came with glory, so that the children of Israel could not look steadfastly upon the face of Moses for the glory of his face, which glory was passing away, how shall not rather the ministration of the Spirit be with glory? For if the ministration of condemnation has glory, much rather does the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. For verily, that which has been made glorious has not been made glorious in this respect, by reason of the glory that surpasses. For if that which passes away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory. So, what's he talking about? This passage zeroes right in on the part of the law that most people want to retain, the 10 Commandments, the tables of stone. First of all, one needs to see what Paul is saying here concerning the law of Moses. In verse 7, he calls it the ministration of death. That's the Mosaic law. In verse 9, he calls it the ministration of condemnation. Now, these are negative descriptions, but they're actually correct descriptions. In verses 4 and 7, the spotlight is on the 10 Commandments, since it is these that were engraven on stones, on tables of stones. The main point then is that the law of Moses, especially as represented by the 10 Commandments, is a ministration of death and a ministration of condemnation. And if the 10 Commandments were still in force today, this would still be true. However, the 10 Commandments are no longer in force, for Paul states in verses 7 and 11 that the law has passed away. The Greek word used here is katargeo, which means to render inoperative. The Mosaic law has been rendered inoperative. Since the emphasis in this passage is on the 10 Commandments, this means that the 10 Commandments have passed away. So the thrust of this is very clear. The law of Moses, especially the 10 Commandments, is no longer in effect. In fact, the superiority of the law of Messiah is seen by the fact that it will never be rendered inoperative. Unlike covenant theology, which we looked at earlier, dispensationalism does not insist that the 10 Commandments are still in force. Dispensationalists do not need to engage in exegetical gymnastics to avoid observing the Sabbath the very way the Ten Commandments actually require. Now, Hebrews 8:13, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. This is Hebrews 8:13. This is what I'm reading here. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The law of Moses became old at the time Jeremiah prophesied the coming of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31:31. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. So the law of Moses, which was now old and disappearing, has now vanished away when Messiah died. Bit of a summary. Law of Moses is a unit comprised of 613 commandments, and all of it has been rendered inoperative. There's no commandment that has continued beyond the cross of Messiah. No Mosaic law has continued beyond the cross of Messiah. The Mosaic law is there and can be used as a teaching tool to show God's standard of righteousness, as well as man's sinfulness and man's need of a substitutionary atonement. It can be used to teach many spiritual truths about God as a man. It can be used to point one to Messiah. Galatians 3:23-25 tell us that. However, it has completely ceased to function as an authority over the individual. It is no longer the rule of life for Jewish or Gentile believers today. Well, what about the moral law? This is the part of the law that Moses that covenant theologians generally try to retain and therefore conclude that the law of Moses is still in effect. The moral law of God refers to those eternal principles that reflect the nature of God. Dispensationalists do not believe the moral law of God terminated at Calvary. Neither do they believe that the moral law of God and the Ten Commandments are identical. The moral law did not begin with Moses and did not terminate with Messiah. Moral law is not identical to the law of Moses. It actually preceded the law of Moses. Adam and Eve broke the moral law long before Moses. And in fact, Satan broke the moral law even before Adam did. He was the first sinner. The law of Moses embodied the moral law, as does the law of Messiah. But the moral law did not originate with the law of Moses. Now, here's in Matthew 5:17-18, this is a favorite objection to the dispensational view of the law of Moses. And this is covenant theologians use this. In Matthew 5, verse 17-18, think not that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass away from the law till all things be accomplished. Yeah, covenant theologians believe that the law of Moses is a rule of life for today. And in quoting this passage, which they use, they're seldom consistent with the implications of their own view. It's obvious that Jesus was speaking of the law of Moses here. Now, even though he was speaking about the law of Moses, no covenant theologian accepts his own thesis, since he must believe in the doing away of many of the commandments of the law of Moses, if not most of them. We've already looked at that. For instance, the commandments concerning priesthood and sacrifice, and others which we already looked at, things like food laws, clothing laws. Regardless of what semantics that they use to describe this change, whether it's whether fulfill means to supersede or brought to greater fulfillment, or bringing out its true meaning, which is some of the explanations that they do use, it's clear that a great many of the 613 commandments no longer apply as they are written. If by the law of Moses, covenant theologians mean only the moral commandments, then their citation of Matthew 17-18 doesn't prove their view, and I will show you why. Verse 19 adds these least commandments. This includes more than the moral commandments in this from chapter 5, 17-19. The emphasis is on the entire law, all 613 commandments. Verse 19 reads, Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So true, we know that Jesus did come to fulfill the law, but the law of Moses did not end with the coming of Jesus, nor by his life, but it ended by his death. As long as he was alive, he was under the Mosaic law system, and he had to fulfill and obey every commandment applicable to him. The statement of Matthew 5:17 to 19, where we can't ignore verse 19, it was made while he was living. Therefore, throughout his life, he had to obey the law of Moses in every manner that Moses commanded, and not in the way that the rabbis of his day had reinterpreted it. Even while he was living, Yeshua already implied the doing away of the law. And one example is what we looked at earlier, Mark 17, verse 19, which states, "This he said, making all meats clean." So Jesus in Mark 17:19 hinted that you're going to be able to eat anything in the future. Lobster, prawns, lamb. Well, you can eat lamb anyway. Pork. Can it be any clearer than this, that at least the dietary commandments have been done away in the Mosaic law? Again, all covenant theologians must admit that great parts of the law no longer apply in the manner prescribed by Moses. So have they been done away with or not? To constantly claim that the law of Moses is still in effect and or that it is the same as the law of Messiah, while ignoring the details of that same law, is inconsistent, and it is totally false. Cannot be. Two different systems. In Matthew 5:17, Yeshua said that he came to fulfill. Now, the Greek term here is the word plerou, and Matthew uses it consistently in reference to fulfilling prophecy and so bringing it to an end. In fact, he used it back in Matthew chapter 1, verses 22 to 23, where he says, "Now all this is come to pass, that it might be fulfilled," there's a fulfilled plerou, "which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet," this is the prophet Isaiah, saying, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." So Matthew states the prophecy of Isaiah 7, verse 14 was fulfilled, and he uses the term plerou. That this fulfillment now brought the prophecy to an end, and so nothing in the future will fulfill it. It's already been fulfilled. So to fulfill meant to accomplish what prophecy demanded, while to abolish meant to fail to fulfill it. So Yeshua, Messiah, he fulfilled the law by his life. He took upon himself the curse and penalty of the law, Mosaic law, and died a penal substitutionary death, and so brought the law, Mosaic law, to an end. So what law system do we have today? We have the law of Messiah. The law of Moses has now been disannulled, and we are now under a new law. And this new law is called the law of Messiah in Galatians 6:2, or probably called the law of Christ in your Bible, or law of Messiah, law of Christ. And it's also called the law of the Spirit of life in Romans chapter 8, verse 2. This is a brand new law, totally separate from the law of Moses. Now, the law of Messiah contains all the individual commandments from Messiah and the apostles applicable to a New Testament believer, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. A simple comparison of the details will show that it is not and cannot be the same as the law of Moses. 4 observations are worth noting here. First of all, many commandments are the same as those of the law of Moses. For example, 9 of the 10 commandments are also in the law of Messiah. But second, many are different from the law of Moses. For example, there is no Sabbath law now. Romans 14, verse 5, and Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 tell us that. And there's also no dietary code. We can eat whatever we like. Mark 7, verse 19, and Romans 14, verse 20 tell us that. What else? Some commandments in the law of Moses are now intensified by the law of Messiah. The law of Moses said, love your neighbor as thyself. That was found in Leviticus 19, verse 18. This now made man the standard. The law of Messiah said, love one another even as I have loved you. John 15, 12. This makes the Messiah the standard, and he loved us enough to die for us. Fourth, the law of Messiah provides a new motivation. The law of Moses was based on the conditional Mosaic covenant, and so the motivation was do in order to be blessed. If you do what I tell you to do, I will bless you. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I will curse you. Law of Messiah is based on the unconditional new covenant, and so the motivation is you have been and are blessed, therefore do. God has done everything for us. Now the expectation is that we will do what he's commanded us to do. The reason there is so much confusion over the relationship between the two laws is that many commandments are similar, and this has led many to conclude that certain sections of the Mosaic law have therefore been retained. We already looked at that. We already said that it cannot be the case, and the explanation for the sameness of some commandments is to be found elsewhere. The explanation can best be understood if it is realized that there are several codes or several law codes in the Bible, such as the Edenic, Adamic, Noahic, Mosaic, the New Covenant Code, and the Messianic Kingdom Code. A new code, a new law code, may contain some of the same commandments of the previous code, but this does not mean that the previous code is still in effect. While certain of the commandments of the Adamic code were also found in the Edenic code, it did not mean that the Edenic code was still partially in force. It ceased to function with the fall of man. The same is true when we compare the law of Messiah with the law of Moses. There are many similar commandments. For example, 9 of the 10 commandments are to be found in the law of Messiah, but this does not mean that the law of Moses is still in force. Law of Moses has been rendered inoperative, and we are now under the law of Messiah, and there are many differences in the commandments. Under the law of Moses, we'd not be allowed to eat pork, but under the law of Messiah, no such prohibition. We can eat whatever we like. There are many similar commandments, but they are nonetheless in two separate systems. Today, if we kill or steal, it is not because of the law of Moses, but it is because of the law of Messiah that we're punished. On the other hand, if I steal, I'm not guilty of breaking the law of Moses, but I'm now guilty of breaking the law of Messiah. Now we have this principle of freedom here. We have this, so now we see that the believer is free from the law of Moses. This means that he's free from the necessity of keeping any commandment of that system. On the other hand, if he wants to, he can keep parts of the law of Moses if he so desires. Jewish believers might want to continue keeping the Sabbath. They can do that. But there's no law in the law of Messiah to do that. They can do it because they choose to. The biblical basis for this freedom to keep the law can be seen in the actions of Paul the Apostle. Now, Paul was the greatest exponent for freedom freedom from the law. His vow in Acts 18, verse 18, his Nazarite vow, is based on Numbers chapter 6, verses 2, 5, 9, and 18. His desire to be in Jerusalem for Shavuot or Pentecost in Acts 20, verse 16, is based on Deuteronomy 16:6, which was a Mosaic law. All men had to be in Jerusalem for 3 set feasts, and one of them was Pentecost. The strongest passage is Acts chapter 21, verses 17 to 26, where we see Paul himself, the apostle of freedom from the law, keeping the law. The believer is free from the law, but he's also free to keep parts of it if he so chooses. So if a Jewish believer feels, he doesn't want to eat pork, he's free to do so. Same is true for all the other commandments. He is free to do whatever he wants to do. Free to do it. There's freedom. However, there are at least 2 dangers that must be avoided by any believer who voluntarily keep some of the commandments of the law of Moses. One danger is the idea that by doing so, he's now contributing to his own justification and sanctification. This is false and should be avoided. You cannot, by doing a work of keeping a now defunct Mosaic law, is not going to contribute to your justification or sanctification. The second danger is in one's expecting others to keep the same commandments he has decided to keep. For instance, if I decide to keep the Sabbath, and now I'm telling you, you must keep the Sabbath as well, this is just as wrong, and this now borders on legalism. The one who exercises his freedom to keep certain parts of the law must also recognize and respect another's freedom not to keep it. And this is where we're going to leave. We're going to end it in this session, because the Sabbath is what we'll be looking at in the next session, and that we need to do that in one total hit. So thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong, and we'll see you next session.